Hello everyone, welcome to this series on the history of English literature, and in this video we are going to discuss the Old English period and the beginnings of English literature in it. Introduction. The origins of English literature are shrouded in mystery and little is known about its early development. It is reasonable to assume that extemporary verse existed long before any written records and that poetry appeared well before prose. The extant remains of Old English literature have come down to us primarily through late copies, some made centuries after the original compositions. Despite these uncertainties, the richness of Old English literature is evident, offering a rewarding experience to those who overcome the language's initial difficulties. Historical background. The historical context of the Old English period spans from the 5th century to approximately 1150, beyond the Norman conquest of 1066. The departure of the Romans in 410 left Britain vulnerable to invasions from the north. According to British traditions, the English from the continent initially came as mercenaries to help defend against the Picts and Scots, but eventually settled permanently by the late 5th century. Over time, they gained control of land from the English Channel to the Firth of Forth. Significant historical events during this period included the Christianization of the pagan English tribes, starting with the work of Irish missionaries in Northumbria and Roman influence beginning in Kent in 597. The 9th century saw the inroads of the Danes, the rise of Wessex under Alfred the Great, and the establishment of the Danelaw. The accession of a Danish king in 1017 and the increasing Norman influence on the English court before the conquest also played crucial roles. These events significantly influenced the literature of the period. Pagan origins. Many poems from this period retain elements of their pagan past. For instance, Widsith and Beowulf exhibit features associated with the pre-Christian era. While earlier scholars viewed the Christian elements in Beowulf as clumsy additions, it is now understood that these elements were more seamlessly integrated. The earliest poems or themes likely originated from the continental home of the English peoples. These themes were the common property of gleemen or scopes who performed them at noble feasts. Over time, Christian ideas influenced these pagan themes, and while the phraseology often remains, it is impossible to classify any extant poetry as purely pagan. This is unsurprising given that the manuscripts were written down in monasteries. Anonymous origins. The anonymity of Old English poets is a significant feature. We have direct mention of only one poet, Cadmon, though none of the extant poems can be definitely attributed to him. Another poet, Cinewulf, signed his poems with runic letters, but beyond these few names, the authors of Old English poetry remain unknown. In contrast, prose came later and was used for practical purposes, allowing for more established authorship. The imitative quality. Much of the prose and some of the poetry from this period were translations or adaptations from Latin. The favored works for translation included the Bible, saints' lives, and various practical texts. The degree of originality in these translations varied, with some following the Latin texts and others reshaped the significant expansions and comments, thereby gaining literary importance. The manuscripts. Only a portion of Old English poetry has survived, but the extant works are likely representative of the period's literature. The surviving manuscripts are late, unique, and 4 in number. The Beowulf manuscript, Cotton Vitellius A. 15th, in the British Museum, dated around 1000, contains Beowulf and Judith. The Junius manuscript, MS Junius 11, in the Bodleian Library, Oxford, named after its owner, Junius contains the so-called Cademonian poems and was first printed in 1655. The Exeter Book, in the chapter library of Exeter Cathedral, donated by Bishop Leofric around 1050, contains 2 of Cynewulf's signed poems. The Vercelli Book, in the Cathedral Library at Vercelli near Milan, contains 2 of Cynewulf's signed poems, Andreas and The Dream of the Rood. The language. Old English literature presents significant challenges due to its vastly different language. The vocabulary is primarily native, with some borrowing from Latin. The grammar is more complex than modern English, with declinable nouns, pronouns, and adjectives, and a more elaborate verbal system. The 4 main dialects of Old English were Northumbrian, the first to produce a literature; Mercian, spoken in the Midlands; Kentish, spoken in an area larger than modern Kent; West Saxon, the language of Alfred the Great, which became standard due to the political supremacy of Wessex and is the dialect in which most extant texts are preserved. Conclusion. The beginnings of English literature are characterized by a blend of pagan and Christian elements, anonymous authorship, imitative translations from Latin, and a rich poetic tradition preserved in a few precious manuscripts. Despite the linguistic challenges, the surviving works of Old English literature offer a profound insight into the cultural and intellectual life of early medieval England. The historical events of the period, from the departure of the Romans to the Norman conquest, shaped this literature, reflecting the complex interplay of tradition and innovation that marks the early stages of English literary history. So this was the first video on the Old English period, where we have discussed the beginnings of literature. We will meet in the next video and discuss some other topic from this period. Until then, goodbye and thank you.